The tent sat exactly where it shouldn't have been, 50 yards off the Cascade Ridge Trail, beneath a stand of Douglas fir that had grown noticeably thicker since anyone last walked this section with purpose. Search and Rescue Coordinator Tom Brennan stood motionless in the August morning light, the radio on his belt crackling with distant chatter, watching his newest volunteer approach the nylon dome with the careful steps of someone who just realized they were walking into history. The fabric was sun-faded but intact. No tears, no animal damage. The zipper was closed from the inside. It was August 17th, 1993, and the woman who'd pitched that tent had been missing since September 1988. 5 years of rain, snow, wind, and the patient work of the wilderness, and the tent looked like someone had simply stepped away for a morning walk and never returned. "Don't touch anything," Brennan said into his handheld, his voice steady despite the tight feeling in his chest. "We've got a scene. Before we dive in, tell us where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe if you enjoy deep, real-world investigations." This one stayed cold for half a decade. The volunteer, a college kid named Danny Marsh doing summer work for the Forestry Service, had been clearing unmarked trails when he'd spotted the green fabric through the trees. His first thought was that someone had abandoned gear. His second thought, when he got close enough to see the dust on the rainfly and the way the surrounding vegetation had grown around the tent stakes, was to call it in immediately. Brennan was already moving down the slope, his boots finding purchase on the dry ground. At 54, he'd been running SAR operations in the Cascades for nearly 20 years. He'd seen bodies recovered from crevasses, hikers found delirious after a week in the backcountry, and remains scattered by scavengers across half a mile of forest floor. But he'd never seen this, a perfectly preserved campsite from a case that had haunted his unit for 5 years. The woman's name was Catherine Reed, 32 years old when she'd signed the trail register at the Cascade Ridge Trailhead on September 8, 1988. Solo hiker, experienced carrying a full pack and enough supplies for a week-long trek. She'd planned to summit 3 peaks, loop back through the valley, and return to her car by September 15th. When she didn't show, and her vehicle sat alone in the dirt lot for another week, the county sheriff's office had initiated a search. Brennan had led that search personally. 36 people over 9 days, covering 40 square miles of terrain, helicopters, dog teams, ground crews working grids. They'd found nothing. No pack, no clothing, no sign of disturbance. It was as if Catherine Reed had walked into the forest and simply ceased to exist. Now, 5 years later, her tent had reappeared like a ghost. Brennan knelt outside the entrance, studying the ground without touching anything. The soil was compressed in a rough rectangle where the tent's footprint had rested, but vegetation had grown around and partially under the edges. Ferns pushed against the nylon. A young hemlock sapling had sprouted less than 2 feet from the back corner, its trunk already an inch thick. "Sheriff's en route!" Danny called from where he stood near the tree line, maintaining the perimeter Brennan had established with a gesture. "ETA 40 minutes. Brennan nodded. 40 minutes to think before the scene became a circus. 40 minutes to look at this the way Catherine Reed would have seen it on her last night, assuming she'd ever made it to this tent at all. The location bothered him immediately. Catherine's planned route, documented in the trail register and in notes she'd left in her car, didn't include this section. Cascade Ridge Trail was a secondary path, less maintained, and it led away from the peaks she'd intended to summit. If she'd pitched her tent here, it meant she'd deviated from her plan significantly, or someone else had pitched it for her. Brennan stood, walking a slow circle around the tent at a distance of 10 feet, his eyes scanning the ground for anything that might explain 5 years of absence. A tent didn't vanish and reappear. Either it had been here the entire time, overlooked somehow during the original search, or someone had placed it here recently. The vegetation told one story. The tent stakes, driven deep and now held firm by root growth, told another. The sun-bleached fabric, faded in the exact pattern of southern exposure beneath this particular canopy, told a third. The tent had been here for years. That much seemed certain, which meant they'd missed it the first time. Brennan felt the weight of that settle in his gut. 9 days of searching, and they'd walked past this spot without seeing it. The Cascade Ridge Trail hadn't been in Catherine's planned route, so it had been given lower priority. They'd checked the main thoroughfares, the popular peaks, the logical places an experienced hiker would go. This secondary trail, overgrown even then, had received only a cursory sweep. He pulled his notebook from his pocket and began sketching the scene. The tent's position relative to the trail, the tree line, the slope of the terrain. Later, the sheriff's photographer would document everything on film, but Brennan liked to have his own reference. His pencil moved across the page, creating a rough map that he'd compare against the topographic charts back at the office. The sound of engines reached him from below, vehicles on the access road, coming up from the valley. The sheriff's team was early. Brennan keyed his radio. "Danny, guide them in. Keep everyone back until I clear the perimeter." "Copy that." The sun was climbing higher, and the forest was waking up around them, birds calling, insects humming, the whisper of wind through the canopy. It was the kind of morning that made you understand why people came to these mountains. Beautiful, peaceful, indifferent to human drama. Brennan looked at the tent one more time before the scene filled with people. The zipper was closed from the inside. That detail kept circling in his mind. If Catherine Reed had left this tent of her own accord, she would have opened it from the outside when she returned, or zipped it open from within before exiting. A closed zipper from the inside suggested someone was still in there when it was sealed. Or something was. Sheriff Dale Morrison arrived with 2 deputies, a photographer, and the county medical examiner, a woman named Dr. Sarah Chen, who'd seen more wilderness deaths than most city coroners saw in a lifetime. They moved through the trees with practiced efficiency, each person knowing their role without needing instruction. Morrison, a lean man in his early 60s with grey hair and sharp eyes, stopped next to Brennan and studied the scene in silence for a full minute before speaking. "This the Reed case?" he asked. "Has to be," Brennan replied. "Location's wrong, but the timing fits. Tent's been here years." "You're sure?" Brennan pointed to the vegetation patterns, the sun fade, the rooted stakes. Morrison followed his finger, nodding slowly. "We walked right past this 5 years ago," Morrison said. "It wasn't a question. We did." They stood together, 2 men who'd spent decades in these mountains, acknowledging a mistake that had cost them 5 years of not knowing. In this work, you learned to live with the weight of what you missed. You learned or you broke. Dr. Chen approached with her field kit, a weathered leather bag that had accompanied her to dozens of recovery sites. She was 43, short, with black hair pulled back in a practical bun, and an expression of professional neutrality that served her well in this work. "Before we open it?" she asked, looking to Morrison. "Photograph everything first," Morrison said. "Then we proceed carefully." The photographer, a young deputy named Marcus Webb, began documenting the scene with his Nikon F4, the motor drive whirring as he worked from multiple angles. Each shot would be developed, printed, and added to the case file, a permanent record of how the tent looked before anyone touched it. Brennan watched the process, his mind already working through scenarios. If Catherine Reed was inside the tent, if her remains had been sealed in there for 5 years, then what had happened to her? Exposure, injury, something else, and why hadn't she tried to leave? The photography took 20 minutes. Webb shot 2 full rolls of 36 exposure film, documenting the tent from every angle, the surrounding vegetation, the position relative to the trail, and close-ups of the stake points and the sealed zipper. When he finished, Morrison looked at Dr. Chen and nodded. She approached the tent, pulling on latex gloves with practiced precision, and knelt in front of the entrance. The zipper was a double-pull design, both tabs resting at the bottom of the opening. She took hold of one carefully and began to draw it upward, the metal teeth separating with a soft hiss that seemed too loud in the quiet forest. The tent opened slowly. The interior was dark, the rain fly blocking most of the light. Dr. Chen pulled a flashlight from her kit and aimed it inside. She held that position for several seconds, her body language revealing nothing. Then she spoke, her voice calm and clinical. Empty, no remains, but there's gear inside. Brennan felt something shift in his chest, not relief exactly, but a recalibration of possibilities. If Catherine wasn't in the tent, then where was she? Morrison moved closer. What kind of gear? Dr. Chen leaned in further, her flashlight playing across the tent's interior. Sleeping bag, backpack, clothing. Looks organized, not disturbed, like she stepped out for a moment. Brennan knelt beside her, peering into the tent. The sleeping bag was rolled neatly in one corner, still in its compression sack. A blue backpack sat against the opposite wall, clearly full. A pair of hiking boots rested near the entrance, laces tied together. She wasn't in here when she disappeared, Brennan said slowly, working through the implications. Or she left and never came back. But why leave your boots? Dr. Chen asked. And your pack? That was the question that changed everything. Morrison authorized the full recovery of the tent and its contents. They would transport everything back to the county sheriff's office, process it methodically, and treat this as an active investigation scene. Despite the 5-year gap, the tent itself would be carefully disassembled and bagged. The gear inside would be catalogued and examined. It took 4 hours to complete the recovery. Each item was photographed in situ before being removed, tagged, and placed in evidence bags. The tent fabric was checked for damage, the stakes were pulled and examined, and the soil beneath the tent floor was probed for anything that might have been buried. They found nothing unusual, no blood, no signs of struggle, no damage that would suggest violence or predation. The tent had simply existed in this spot, sealed and untouched, while the forest grew around it. By early afternoon, the site was clear. Only the compressed rectangle of dead vegetation remained, marking where the tent had stood for 5 years. Danny Marsh stayed behind to place barrier tape around the area, preserving it in case they needed to return. Brennan rode back to town in Morrison's patrol vehicle, the evidence bag secured in the cargo area behind them. Neither man spoke much during the 40-minute drive. Both were thinking about Catherine Reed, about where she might be, and what it meant that her tent and gear had been found without her. The county sheriff's office was a brick building on Main Street, 2 stories with holding cells in the basement and administrative offices on the upper floor. Morrison had commandeered the largest conference room as an investigation space, and by late afternoon, Catherine Reed's recovered belongings were spread across 2 folding tables under fluorescent lights that buzzed softly overhead. Brennan stood at one table, carefully unrolling the sleeping bag. It was a Coleman model, rated for cold weather, still in good condition despite years of storage in the tent. When he shook it out, something fell from the folds, a small spiral-bound notebook with a blue cover. He picked it up carefully, his pulse quickening. Field notes, maybe. Or a journal. Morrison appeared at his shoulder. "What have you got?" "Writing of some kind." Brennan opened the notebook to the first page. The handwriting was precise, controlled, the letters small and evenly spaced. The first entry was dated September 8, 1988, the day Catherine had signed the trail register. Day 1. Made good time to the Cascade Ridge Trail Junction. Legs felt strong. Set up camp at 4 p.m., about 6 miles in. Weather clear. Will summit Harper Peak tomorrow if conditions hold. Brennan turned the page. The next entry was dated September 9th. Day 2. Changed plans. Harper Peak approach looked unstable from the valley. Recent rockfall. Decided to explore the Cascade Ridge Trail instead. Less traveled, more interesting. Found an excellent campsite off-trail. Set up for a couple of nights here. The third entry, September 10th, was shorter. Day 3, heard something last night. Large animal, maybe a bear. Stayed in the tent. Everything looks fine this morning, but I'm keeping my food hung high. September 11th. Day 4, explored the ridge system. Beautiful country. Found an old fire lookout foundation. Photos taken. Returned to camp by 3 p.m. Weather changing. Clouds moving in. September 12th. Day 5. Rain started during the night. Heavy. Staying in the tent today, reading, listening to the forest, peaceful. Then the handwriting changed. The letters became less controlled, the spacing irregular. September 13th, day 6, rain continues, starting to feel strange, dizzy spells, probably just dehydrated, drank more water, should be fine. September 14th, day 7, something's wrong, can't focus, headache, nausea, tried to pack up but too weak, lying down now. The final entry was dated September 15th, the day Catherine was supposed to return to her car. Day 8, can't walk, can't think clearly, need to get down, need help, but legs won't work. Vision blurring, sorry, so sorry. The writing trailed off at the end, the final word barely legible. Brennan looked at Morrison. Neither man spoke for a moment. She was sick, Morrison finally said. Something happened to her in that tent. But she's not there now, Brennan replied. She got out somehow. Or someone found her. Dr. Chen had joined them, reading over Brennan's shoulder. The symptoms she describes are consistent with several conditions. Carbon monoxide poisoning if she was using a camp stove in an enclosed space. Dehydration leading to electrolyte imbalance. Possibly a contaminated water source causing giardiasis or another parasitic infection. The rapid onset suggests something acute. Morrison was already thinking ahead. The backpack. What's in it? They turned to the other table where Catherine's pack lay open. The deputy who'd been cataloguing its contents looked up from his clipboard. Standard hiking gear, he reported. Water purification tablets, unused. Freeze-dried meals, still sealed. First aid kit, map and compass, camera loaded with film. Personal items, and this. He held up a small camping stove, an MSR Whisper Light, one of the most popular backpacking stoves of the era. The fuel bottle was still attached, about half full. Dr. Chen took the stove carefully, examining it. Did she use this in the tent? Brennan thought about the journal entries. Rain on September 12th and 13th. Catherine staying inside, probably cooking meals to stay warm and fed. She probably did, he said. The journal mentions she stayed in the tent during heavy rain. If she was cooking inside for warmth, and if the tent wasn't properly ventilated. Carbon monoxide, Dr. Chen finished. Colorless, odorless. It would explain the symptoms: dizziness, headache, nausea, weakness, confusion. If she was repeatedly exposing herself to it over several days, the cumulative effect could be severe. Morrison leaned against the table, arms crossed. So she's poisoning herself with her own stove, realizes something's wrong, but by then she's too weak to help herself. What happens next? That was the question that would drive the investigation for the next 3 weeks. Would you have made the same call if you'd been in their place? Staying in the tent during bad weather, cooking inside for comfort? The immediate priority was finding Catherine Reed. If she'd left the tent sometime after September 15th, 1988, either under her own power or with assistance, there would be a trail. The challenge was picking up a 5-year-old trail in terrain that had seen countless storms, snowfalls, and the daily work of erosion. Brennan organized a new search operation, this time centered on the tent site. The theory was simple. If Catherine had been too weak to walk, but had managed to leave the tent, she couldn't have gone far. They would work in expanding circles, looking for any sign of her passage or final location. The search began 3 days after the tent's recovery, on August 20th, 1993. Brennan assembled a team of 20 volunteers, experienced SR personnel, forestry workers, and skilled trackers who understood how to read the forest. They worked in pairs, walking careful grids through the terrain surrounding the tent site. The weather was cooperative, dry and clear, with good visibility under the canopy. Each team carried topographic maps marked with the tent's location, radios for communication, and probe poles for checking suspicious ground depressions. On the second day, a team working northeast of the tent site found something, a depression in the ground that didn't quite match the natural terrain. It was roughly 6 feet long, 3 feet wide, and slightly recessed, as if the soil had settled over time. Brennan was on scene within 20 minutes, bringing Dr. Chen and the county's forensic team. They cordoned off the area and began a careful excavation, removing soil 1 layer at a time, screening it for any evidence. 18 inches down, they found bone. Dr. Chen identified it immediately, a human femur, weathered but intact. They continued excavating with increased care, and over the next 6 hours, they recovered a complete skeleton, lying in an informal grave in the soft forest soil. The remains were arranged naturally, not positioned or manipulated. The body had been placed on its back, arms at its sides. There was no coffin, no shroud, just the earth and time. Catherine Reed had been buried less than 200 yards from her tent. The forensic recovery took the rest of the day and into the evening. Dr. Chen supervised every step, ensuring the remains and any associated evidence were properly documented and preserved. By the time they finished, the sun had set, and they worked under portable lights that cast harsh shadows through the trees. Back at the medical examiner's facility, Dr. Chen began the analysis that would answer the fundamental questions. Was this Catherine Reed? How did she die? And how did she end up buried in the forest? The identification came first. Dental records matched conclusively. The skeleton recovered from the forest grave was Catherine Reed, missing since September 1988, found 5 years later, just as the summer was ending again. The cause of death was more complex. Dr. Chen examined the bones carefully, looking for signs of trauma, disease, or any physical evidence that might explain what happened. She found nothing conclusive. No broken bones, no marks of violence, no indications of predation. The skeleton tells us she died, but not how, Dr. Chen explained to Morrison and Brennan in her office 3 days after the recovery. Given the journal entries and the camp stove, I believe carbon monoxide poisoning is the most likely cause. The symptoms she described are classic. The fact that she was found so close to the tent suggests she was too weak to go far. But someone buried her, Morrison said. She didn't bury herself. That was the second mystery. Brennan had been thinking about this since they'd found the grave. Someone had discovered Catherine Reed, already deceased or dying, and had taken the time to dig a grave and bury her body. Then they'd left the tent and all her gear behind, untouched. Who buries a body and doesn't report it? He asked. Dr. Chen considered this. Someone who didn't want to be found, someone who couldn't report it for legal reasons, or someone who believed they were doing the right thing but operated outside normal channels. Morrison stood and walked to the window, looking out at the street below. We need to find out who else was in those mountains in September 1988. Hikers, hunters, forestry workers. Someone buried her, and that person is a witness at minimum. The investigation shifted focus. They pulled trail registers from September 1988, contacted the Forestry Service for work schedules, and reached out to local hunting clubs to identify anyone who might have been in the Cascade Ridge area during that week. The trail registers provided 23 names of people who'd signed in at various trailheads during the relevant period. Morrison's team began tracking them down, conducting interviews by phone and in person. Most were dead ends. Hikers who'd been on different trails, hunters who'd worked other areas. But 3 weeks into the investigation, they found someone who remembered something unusual. His name was Robert Halloran, a retired postal worker who'd been hiking the Cascades regularly for 30 years. In September 1988, he'd been on a solo backpacking trip through the valley system below Cascade Ridge. Morrison and Brennan drove 6 hours to interview him at his home in Bend, Oregon. Halloran was 71, still fit and sharp, with the weathered look of someone who'd spent his life outdoors. He invited them into his living room, where topographic maps covered one wall, his lifetime of routes and memories. "I remember that trip," he said when Morrison showed him the dates. "Early September, 88. I was doing a long loop, maybe 12 days total. Beautiful weather at first, then that storm system came through." "You were in the Cascade Ridge area?" Brennan asked. "Passed through it. I wasn't on the trail itself, but I was in the valley below. I remember because I saw something odd." Morrison leaned forward. "What did you see?" Halloran stood and walked to his map wall, pointing to a section of terrain. "I was camped here, about 2 miles from where you said the woman's tent was found. On September 14th or 15th, I'd have to check my old journals to be sure. I saw smoke. Not much, just a thin column through the trees, higher up on the ridge. Didn't think much of it at the time. Figured it was another camper." "Just smoke?" Brennan asked. "That's all I saw from my position, but here's the thing that stuck with me. The next morning, I hiked up to that area to refill my water from a stream I knew was up there, and I found footprints." "Describe them," Morrison said, pulling out his notebook. "Heavy boots, large. Definitely a man's print, maybe size 11 or 12. Deep impression, like he was carrying weight. The prints went up the ridge and back down again. I followed them for a while out of curiosity, but they disappeared into rocky ground. I remember thinking whoever it was knew how to move through the backcountry. The route they took was efficient, not something a casual hiker would choose." Brennan felt pieces clicking into place. This was after the storm started. During or just after, the ground was wet, which is why the prints were so clear. But here's the part I've wondered about over the years. I found something else near where I saw those prints. He walked to a closet and returned with a cardboard box. Inside was a collection of items he'd found over decades of hiking. Interesting rocks, old bottles, pieces of camping gear. He pulled out a small object wrapped in tissue paper and handed it to Morrison. It was a ranger's badge, tarnished but intact. The number was still legible, 247. "Found it near those boot prints," Halloran said. "Always meant to turn it in, but I never got around to it. Figured whoever lost it would report it and get a new one." Morrison looked at Brennan. Both men understood the implication. Someone with a ranger's badge had been in that area during the time Catherine Reed died. Someone with large boots who knew how to move through the mountains efficiently. Back at the sheriff's office, Morrison contacted the U.S. Forest Service and requested personnel records for September 1988. Specifically, they wanted to know which rangers had been assigned to the Cascade Ridge area and which ranger had been issued badge number 247. The answer came back within a week. Badge 247 had been issued to Forest Ranger James Keller, assigned to the Cascade Mountain District from 1985 to 1990. He'd been on active duty in September 1988. Keller was still alive, retired now, living in a small town called Riverdale, about 2 hours south. Morrison called ahead and arranged to meet with him, explaining that they were following up on an old case. Keller agreed to talk, and on a cool morning in mid-September 1993, almost exactly 5 years after Catherine Reed had died, Morrison and Brennan drove to Riverdale. James Keller lived in a modest house at the end of a gravel road, surrounded by second-growth forest. He was 61, grey-haired, with the solid build of someone who'd spent his career working outdoors. He met them on his porch, coffee in hand, his expression neutral, but his eyes watchful. "You said this was about an old case," he began. Morrison explained the situation: Catherine Reed's disappearance, the discovery of her tent and remains, and the evidence that suggested someone had buried her in September 1988. Keller listened without interrupting, his face carefully controlled. When Morrison finished, he was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "I buried her." The admission came without preamble, without excuse, just a simple statement of fact. Brennan felt the relief of finally knowing mix with the frustration of 5 years lost. "Tell us what happened." Keller set down his coffee and looked out at the trees. "I was doing a routine patrol on September 15th. Weather had been bad. Heavy rain, poor visibility. I was checking on campsites, making sure no one was in trouble. Found her tent about 2 hours before dark. Called out, no answer. Checked inside and found her lying in the entrance, already gone. She was cold. Been dead for a few hours, I figured." "You didn't report it," Morrison said. "No." Keller's jaw tightened. "I should have. I know that. But I panicked. I was going through a divorce custody battle for my kids. My ex was already telling the court I was irresponsible, that I couldn't be trusted. I was terrified that if I reported finding a dead hiker on my patrol, it would be twisted into somehow being my fault, that I'd lose my job and lose my kids." He rubbed his face, the weight of 5 years evident in the gesture. "So I buried her, dug the grave right there, used my hands and a small camp shovel I carried. Took me hours. I was crying the whole time, asking her forgiveness. I didn't disturb her gear, didn't take anything, just gave her what I thought was a decent burial and walked away. Then I spent the next 5 years hating myself for it." Brennan absorbed this. It wasn't malice or cruelty. It was fear and poor judgment compounded by circumstance. Still, Catherine Reed's family had spent 5 years not knowing. That was the real crime. "Did you know what killed her?" Morrison asked. "I figured exposure or illness. Her camp stove was in the tent, and I could smell the fuel. I wondered if she'd poisoned herself accidentally, but I'm not a doctor. I just knew she was gone, and I made a terrible decision about what to do next." Morrison looked at Brennan, a silent question passing between them. Then he turned back to Keller. "You'll need to make a formal statement," Morrison said, "and there may be charges. At minimum, failure to report a death, possibly more. But you telling us now counts for something." Keller nodded, accepting this. "I've been waiting for this conversation for 5 years. Part of me is relieved it's finally here." The drive back was quiet. Brennan watched the mountains pass by the window, thinking about Catherine Reed alone in her tent, growing weaker, unable to help herself. Thinking about James Keller finding her and making a choice that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The prosecution of James Keller was handled by the county attorney. Given the circumstances, the passage of time, Keller's cooperation, and the mitigating factors that had influenced his decision, he was charged with failure to report a death and improper handling of remains. He pleaded guilty and received a suspended sentence with probation, plus a requirement to perform community service. It wasn't satisfying exactly, but it was resolution. Catherine Reed's remains were released to her family in October 1993. They held a memorial service at a church in Seattle, attended by friends, family, and several members of the search team who'd looked for her 5 years earlier. Brennan attended, standing in the back, watching people say goodbye to a woman he'd never met but had spent so much time searching for. Morrison was there too, along with Dr. Chen and several others from the investigation. After the service, Catherine's younger sister approached them. Her name was Jennifer. And she looked like Catherine might have, same features, same build. "Thank you for finding her," she said simply. "It means everything to finally know." Brennan nodded, accepting this. It wasn't enough to erase 5 years of searching, but it was something. The case file was officially closed in November 1993. The final report ran to 247 pages, documenting every aspect of the investigation from Catherine's initial disappearance through the recovery of her remains and the identification of how she died. The technical cause of death was listed as carbon monoxide poisoning, though Dr. Chen noted in her report that without soft tissue to analyze, this remained a highly probable but not definitively proven conclusion. The physical evidence, the camp stove, the journal entries describing progressive symptoms, and the circumstances of her death all supported this determination. The tent, sleeping bag, and other gear were eventually returned to Catherine's family. The journal was photocopied and retained as part of the case file, but the original was also returned. Jennifer Reed later told Morrison she kept it in a box with her sister's other belongings, a reminder of a life cut short by a simple mistake that so many backpackers had made and survived. Brennan retired from search and rescue in 1995, 2 years after the Catherine Reed case closed. In his final report, he noted that the case had taught him an important lesson about assumptions. They'd searched extensively in 1988 but had concentrated on Catherine's planned route. The Cascade Ridge Trail, being outside that plan, had received less attention. One more day of searching in 1988, one more team checking secondary trails, and they might have found her tent with Catherine's body still inside, saving 5 years of questions. But that's the nature of this work. You do your best with the information you have, and you learn from what you miss. The case had one final postscript. In 1997, the Forest Service installed a memorial plaque at the Cascade Ridge trailhead. It read, "In memory of Catherine Reed, 1956 to 1988, experienced hiker, nature lover, lost to these mountains. Always check your camp stove ventilation. Always tell someone your plans. Always come home." Brennan visited the plaque once on what would have been Catherine's 43rd birthday. He stood there for a while, looking at the mountains that held so many secrets, and thought about the fragile line between a peaceful camping trip and a tragedy no one sees coming. The tent itself was eventually donated to a search and rescue training center, where it's used to teach new volunteers about the importance of proper equipment use and the dangers that can lurk even in seemingly safe campsites. Instructors use Catherine's story as a case study, a reminder that wilderness safety isn't just about bears and cliffs and getting lost. Sometimes it's about understanding that the tools meant to keep you safe can become deadly if used without care. The investigation into Catherine Reed's death revealed no villains, no malice, no great conspiracy, just a series of small decisions and circumstances that added up to tragedy. She stayed in her tent during heavy rain, seeking comfort and warmth. She cooked inside with insufficient ventilation. She poisoned herself slowly over several days, too confused and weak by the end to save herself. And then James Keller found her and made a choice born of fear that caused 5 years of additional pain for everyone who loved her. Morrison retired in 1999, a year before the new millennium. At his retirement party, someone asked him what case stuck with him most over his 34 years in law enforcement. He thought about it for a moment, then said, "It was Catherine Reed. Because it showed me that sometimes the mystery isn't what happened," he explained. "It's why we didn't find out sooner. The tent was there the whole time. She was there the whole time. We just didn't look in quite the right place." The Reed case changed how search operations were conducted in the Cascade Mountain region. After 1993, any missing hiker case prompted searches that included all trails and accessible areas within a 20-mile radius, regardless of planned routes. Secondary trails received equal attention to primary ones. And search teams were trained specifically about the phenomenon of planned deviation, the tendency of hikers to change routes based on conditions, interest, or whim. These changes didn't bring Catherine back, but they meant that future searches might not miss what the Reed search had missed. For Jennifer Reed, closure came slowly. She told reporters in a 1995 interview that knowing what happened to her sister was both a relief and a renewed source of pain. Relief because the uncertainty was over. Pain because the truth was so simple and preventable. Catherine was careful, Jennifer said. She was experienced. She knew the mountains. But even careful people make mistakes, especially when they're alone and something goes wrong. I think about that a lot, how she must have realized something was wrong, tried to push through it, and eventually just couldn't. I hope it was peaceful at the end. D'ici, the journal Catherine kept, remains one of the most poignant artifacts of the case. Those final entries, growing progressively less coherent as the carbon monoxide accumulated in her system, showed someone trying to understand what was happening to them, trying to make plans to save themselves, and ultimately being overcome by forces they couldn't fight. Day 8. Can't walk, can't think clearly, need to get down, need help. But legs won't work, vision blurring. Sorry, so sorry. Sorry to whom? Her family, probably. Maybe to herself for not being more careful. Maybe to the mountains for not being able to complete her planned trek. The word hangs there in the journal, a final apology from someone who had nothing to apologize for. Carbon monoxide poisoning from camping stoves is a known hazard, but it remains uncommon enough that many backpackers are unaware of the risk. Modern camping stoves come with warnings printed on the fuel bottles and in the instruction manuals. Outdoor education courses emphasize the importance of ventilation. Still, each year, a small number of campers make the same mistake Catherine made, cooking inside a tent during bad weather, seeking warmth and comfort, not realizing they're slowly poisoning themselves. The symptoms are insidious: headache, dizziness, nausea, all things that can be attributed to altitude, dehydration, or simple fatigue. By the time you realize something is seriously wrong, you may be too confused and weak to help yourself. And if you're alone, as Catherine was, there's no one to notice that you're in trouble until it's too late. The Forest Service ranger who found her, James Keller, lived with his decision for the rest of his life. In an interview conducted in 2003 as part of a documentary on wilderness safety, he spoke about that day in September 1988. "I think about her every September," he said. "When the weather turns and the light changes. I think about the choice I made, and I wish I could go back and make a different one. I robbed her family of closure for 5 years because I was scared. That's something I can never take back or make right." Keller died in 2008 at the age of 76. His obituary made no mention of the Catherine Reed case, but those who knew him knew it had defined his later years. He'd become an advocate for wilderness safety education, speaking at schools and hiking clubs about the importance of proper equipment use and the dangers of complacency in the backcountry. Brennan, now in his 80s and still living in the Cascades, occasionally leads training sessions for new search and rescue volunteers. He always includes the Reed case in his curriculum, using it to teach about systematic searching, the importance of checking secondary routes, and the ways wilderness tragedies can hide in plain sight. "The tent was 50 yards off the trail," he tells the new recruits. 50 yards. We walked past it multiple times during the original search. We didn't see it because we weren't looking for it in that particular spot. That's the lesson. You have to look everywhere, not just where you think someone should be. The mountains don't judge and don't remember. The spot where Catherine Reed's tent stood for 5 years has been reclaimed by the forest. The vegetation has grown back, the soil has settled, and there's no visible sign that anything unusual ever happened there. Only the memorial plaque at the trailhead marks the tragedy, and many hikers walk past it without stopping to read the inscription. But for those who worked the case, who searched for Catherine Reed in 1988 and again in 1993, who finally brought her home and pieced together what happened to her, the memory remains sharp. It's a reminder of how quickly things can go wrong in the wilderness, how small mistakes can compound into tragedy, and how the truth can hide in plain sight for years before finally revealing itself. Catherine Reed went into the mountains in September 1988, seeking solitude and beauty. She found both, and she found death in a way so quiet and preventable that it took 5 years for anyone to understand what had happened. Her story isn't about a monster or a murderer. It's about the wilderness itself, beautiful, indifferent, and occasionally deadly to those who forget how quickly comfort can become danger. The tent that was found perfectly intact 5 years later wasn't a supernatural mystery or a cryptic puzzle. It was exactly what it appeared to be, a campsite where someone died alone, sealed from the inside by a zipper that couldn't be opened from beyond death. Preserved by chance and the particular conditions of that spot in the forest, waiting to tell its story when someone finally looked in the right place. What would you have done differently if you'd been Catherine Reed, sensing something was wrong but unable to fully understand the danger you were in? The mountains ask that question of everyone who enters them, and sometimes the answer comes too late. If you appreciate real investigations like this one, subscribe and stay curious, because every wilderness mystery has a truth waiting to be found, even if it takes 5 years to reveal itself.